Morning folks, welcome to this week's lessons on Macbeth. It's Mr. Blower here and I'll be hosting the next two lessons. Right, before we crack on with today's work, I wanted to give a quick pep talk to those of you out there who are scratching your heads and wondering why we're bothering to study the work of the guy who is pictured mid-screen. No, this is not a portrait of Mr. Trow during lockdown. It is, of course, William Shakespeare, complete with trendy earring. So, aside from his fashion sense and passing resemblance to Mr. Trow, what does he have to offer? Well, we would expect Shakespeare's work to contain poetry, and it does. Those of you not attracted by that might be interested in the politics and the political conflicts that take place within Shakespeare's work, especially in Macbeth. We also have philosophy, sociology, ideas about gender, power, social structures, history, as you'll have found out from your study of context in week 1, psychology, a particularly interesting aspect of Shakespeare's plays that allows us to explore the human mind and what motivates the actions of the characters. We also have biology. There's plenty of murder and sex in Shakespeare's plays, although Macbeth errs more on the side of murder. And we also have the sense of past, present, and future. The idea that Shakespeare's work is timeless. It was relevant then, in the early 1600s when it was written. It's relevant now, and it will continue to be relevant in years to come. So, hopefully that's piqued your interest somewhat, and we're now ready to get stuck into exploring Act 1, Scene 1. So if you could write down today's title and make sure that you've got your Macbeth notebook or file and a copy of Act 1, Scene 1 that was attached to show my homework in front of you, ready to use. Okay, if you want to pause the video to write down the title, you can. And we will now crack on with the do now task. Now, I've tried to make today's lesson a little more like a typical lesson when you're at school, hence the reason we're doing a do now task. Now, all I want you to do to start off with is create a list or mind map that features any words that you'd associate with the word witch. So a little bit of creative thinking, a little bit of vocabulary work around that key word in today's lesson. If you like a challenge when making your list, you might consider the contextual information about witchcraft that you were taught previously. Again, pause the video and spend a couple of minutes doing that task. Okay, so you've now got a list of vocabulary that you've associated with the word witch. I'm just going to run through a few things that I came up with when I did the same task. Now, I'm sure you've got cauldrons and toads and black cats and all of the other stereotypical tropes that we associate with witches and witchcraft. I've got one of those in that we often associate witches and the idea of witchcraft with women. A witch is typically a woman, as was the case in Shakespeare's time when many women were persecuted, tried and executed for being witches. We've got the word weird, the idea of abnormality, coming from beyond the normal. That links with the idea of being supernatural. Paranormal, again, unnatural. We have the idea of an incantation. We think that maybe witches are devious, hence the reason that many of them were tried and convicted of their so-called crimes. Deceptive, dangerous, disruptive, malevolent, outsiders, marginalized, pariah or pariahs, victim, vilified, and persecuted, a word I've already mentioned. Now, if you're again wondering what some of those words mean, pause the video, add at least 3 of those words to your mind map or your list, and if a word is new to you, don't just ignore it. Take a minute to look it up and then add it plus a brief definition to your notes. The purpose of this is to make sure that you have a broad vocabulary so that when you're writing about witches or writing about the theme of the supernatural in Macbeth, which is one that hasn't actually come up in previous years, so could do next year, you have a broad vocabulary with which to express your ideas. Okay, so pause the video now and just add a little bit of that new vocabulary to your list. Okay, now I've also popped a little challenge question in at this point, which you'll see at the bottom right of your screen, which is which aspects of witches or witchcraft do you think James I, or in fact any ruler or monarch, someone in power, would have feared the most, and why? Again, if you'd like to take on that challenge question, pause the video and jot down your ideas. I think if you're someone who's aiming for grade 7, 8 or 9, these sort of challenge questions that ask you to consider and evaluate the context of the play really will help to stretch your thinking, and are the type of activities that you should attempt. Okay, now that we have a broad vocabulary with which we can describe witches and witchcraft, we are going to move on to just looking at the main objectives for today's lesson. So what are we going to do today? We're going to try and answer the question, how does Shakespeare begin the play? And crucially, what kind of mood or atmosphere is created at this crucial early stage? In doing that, we're going to consider stagecraft. Now, you may well have heard of this. If you're a drama student, I'm sure you know what stagecraft is. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, stagecraft is basically the way that a scene or the way that a play is staged, the theatrical techniques that are used to bring the action and the characters and the setting to life. And that's an aspect of the play that we're going to consider when we read and watch the scene. And we'll be watching a couple of video versions, a couple of performances of Act 1, Scene 1 to give you a flavour of that stagecraft. Okay, we're also going to be analysing the scene, zooming on some important quotes and details and identifying key themes. This for me is where Shakespeare really comes alive. And this is why I love English, that opportunity to explore language choices, explore structural choices, and start playing with ideas and exploring meaning. Okay, we're also going to consider how our context knowledge might help us interpret the witches. It's important to stress that context is not an assessed element of the Macbeth section of the GCSE. However, again, if you're targeting grade 7, 8 or 9, you'll want to try and show something called evaluative skill, which is in band 1 of the mark scheme. And in that band, examiners may be looking for students to make connections between the context and the play, just to show that breadth of understanding and knowledge. And we're going to finish today's lesson by writing a paragraph answering the question above. How does Shakespeare begin the play, and what kind of mood or atmosphere is created? Okay, we will move on. Right, we've mentioned stagecraft. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see that there is a script, and that script covers the whole of Act 1, Scene 1. And you may be thinking, great, Act 1, Scene 1 is really short, and I'll be able to write a couple of lines and cover all the bases. Well, as we'll explore later on, Act 1, Scene 1 might be short, but it is very complex and very rich in language and themes and contexts. Before we get to that though, if you could just jot down the subheading that you'll see over on the right-hand side of the screen, which says Stagecraft, Establishing Mood and Atmosphere, and then have a go at answering the following questions. Read the scene. I can do that with you. Although on second thoughts, you're probably best off being spared my ropey Scottish accent. So instead, just take a moment to read that scene through on your own. Okay, once you've done that, have a go at answering the following questions. Firstly, how would you light the stage or the characters? Now, that doesn't mean set them on fire. That means how would you use lighting on the stage to depict aspects of their character or to start to create a mood and atmosphere? Secondly, would you include any sound effects? Now, you might think if I was doing this in Shakespeare's time, my use of sound effects would be rather limited. But whether you're setting it now or then, what sort of sound would you include and why? You might also consider the use of props. Now, props, fascinating fact here, folks, is actually an abbreviation of property, as in property of the stage. But what sort of items, what sort of props would you use to decorate the stage and add to that scene that's being created? Number 4, how quickly should the lines be read? Would the pace change at any point? Now, pace, rhythm, is crucial to this scene and to Shakespeare's plays in general, because it really gives us a sense of the characters' emotions and a sense of drama that's taking place within the scene. And then finally, number 5, how would you direct the actors to move? I say finally, there's going to be a number 6, isn't there? Yes, there it is, number 6. How would you have the actors or witches leave the stage? So the last couple are asking you to think about their movement on stage. So pause the video, take some time to answer as many of those questions as you can and familiarise yourself with that idea of stagecraft. Okay, hopefully you have now had time to think about the way that this first scene would be staged, the way that it would be produced and brought to life in the theatre. If you're still a bit lost and are thinking, I haven't got a clue, I'm not sure, I'm not a theatre director, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, sir. For those people, let's have a look at this particular production of Act 1, Scene 1. As we watch, notice things like costume, lighting, any sound effects that are taking place, and the use of props that we will see on stage.
When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain?
When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won.
That will be ere the set of sun.
Where the place?
Upon the heath,
There to meet with Macbeth.
I come, grey Malkin, head of calls.
Anon.
fair is foul and foul is fair, over through the fog and filthy air.
Okay, so this rather modern adaptation is fascinating, I think, from the point of view of the use of props. You'll see that they have a map laid out in front of them, and that, like generals in an army, they're positioning the armies or the soldiers into territories where they want them to act, where they want them to fight, where they want conflict to take place. And that idea of the witches taking charge of the situation and actually directing, dictating the conflict in the play is one that we will look at again when we look at Act 1, Scene 1 in more detail later on in today's lesson. Okay, just as a point of contrast, I wanted us to take a look at another adaptation. This one's eerier, more cinematic, but I'll let you watch it, generate some ideas about the way that stagecraft has been used to present these supernatural women at the start of the play.
Shall we three meet again? Thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won. That will be where the set of the sun, where the place, upon the heath, there to meet me, Macbeth. Come, grey Malkin, what it calls, anon.
Okay, as you can see there, a much more disturbing depiction of the witches, a much more malevolent depiction of the witches. Malevolent, a word that appeared on our word list earlier, meaning evil in action or intent. Okay, now we've got a sense of the stagecraft and what Act 1, Scene 1 might look like on the stage were you to go to the theatre to watch a production of Macbeth. We're now going to move on to the more kind of English literature style stuff, which is looking at language and how Shakespeare and other writers use language and structure to communicate certain meanings. Now, on the screen, you'll see a range of subject terminology, starting with the word tone and working down to potentially a new one for most of you, which is trochaic tetrameter. Now, in the table below, you'll see 4 columns, terms I don't yet know, so you haven't got a clue. Terms I recognise, so you've seen it, but you're not 100% sure that you could define what it means and explain what it is. The next column says terms I can give an example of. So here your understanding is a little bit more concrete, a little bit clearer. And then finally, terms I can explain. So you'd be able to turn around to someone else and say, right, so foreshadowing is, and potentially give an example as well. So if you pause the video and take a moment to just organise those terms into one of those 4 boxes that you think is appropriate for you and your level of knowledge. Okay, if you're sat there thinking, goodness me, this language is really challenging, I haven't got a clue, fear not, we are going to come back to all of this language at some point during the lesson. And some of it, terminology like trochaic tetrameter and paradox are not words or terms that you all need to understand inside out. Again, I'm just trying to include elements in today's lesson that really will stretch and challenge those people who are targeting grades 7, 8 and 9 in their GCSE English Literature exam. We'll come back to this table at the end of the lesson, reevaluate our knowledge and understanding of these terms, and hopefully what we'll see is that some of the terms have moved from ones that you didn't know or ones that you recognise but couldn't explain into these columns that show a more solid understanding. Okay, now for the next part of today's lesson, you are going to need this sheet in front of you. This was downloadable from Show My Homework. As you'll see, it's got Act 1, Scene 1 in the centre. The lines that are italicised, those lines are stage directions, and stage directions obviously play an important role in any play and are things that you shouldn't ignore when it comes to writing about the play. They often are very instructive and often full of connotations, symbolism that you can explore when you analyse a scene. Up at the top, you've got a box to record 3 or 4 crucial key themes that take place within this scene or that come about as a result of this key scene. We'll go through those together later. You've got key terminology. So some of those words that we've just written down, just explored, you would record up here. We're going to try and make some links to the rest of the play because in the second part of your Shakespeare exam, you will be asked to write an essay that tests your knowledge and understanding, not just of one scene, but of the whole play, of a theme or character across the play. So it's really important that at this early stage, we can make connections between what happens in a scene like Act 1, Scene 1, and how that relates to the middle and the end of the play, how that theme of the supernatural, how the influence of witches and witchcraft carry themselves through the whole of the play. And then we might think here about the purpose of the witches. Here's, again, an example of evaluative skill. We might be thinking, why has Shakespeare chosen to include these supernatural characters in this play? What purpose do they perform in terms of their dramatic role? Okay, we might describe them as a catalyst, for example, or just in terms of the way that they interact with other characters, or the way that they're supposed to make the audience feel. So the purpose of the witches might be to frighten the audience, or to make King James sit uncomfortably in his very comfortable throne-like seat from which he's watching the play. Okay, now in the first couple of weeks, you were told a lot about context and you were given summaries of plot and character. This week, I want the emphasis to be much more on you and you're developing your own independent understanding of Macbeth. That's going to be crucial for your success in this section of the exam. So if you feel that you're confident in analysing details of a scene, what you'll find in front of you is just a copy of Act 1, Scene 1, and I've just emboldened and underlined some features that might be of particular interest. So if you prefer to just do things independently and want to explore language and structure yourself and annotate your copy of Act 1, Scene 1 with your own ideas, pause the video now and spend some time doing that. If, however, you think, well, I'm not really sure where to start, sir, fair enough. What I've done is added a bunch of questions that might direct you to particular parts of the scene and allow you to develop your thinking. Now, you don't have to answer all of these questions. Some of them are quite straightforward. Some of them are much more complex, and we will go through the answers to these questions together in a few minutes' time. But pause the video now, work your way through as many of those questions as you can, and try to be creative with your thinking. There is no harm in taking risks. This is one of the beauties of English, is that we can interpret, we can explore meaning without feeling that we're necessarily going to be wrong in doing so. So look at the words, look at some of the punctuation, look at the way the scene is organised, and just think, what do we think Shakespeare was trying to achieve? What might that word mean? What might it suggest about that character or to the audience? Okay, pause the video, have a go at that analysis. Okay, now that you have had a go at exploring the scene, maybe with the aid of those questions or not, we will go through some of those features together, and I'll just give you a little bit of input in terms of what some of the meanings and some of the interpretations could be. Now, the beauty of studying the play via video is that you can pause and rewind and check at any point. So we can very much go at your own pace. So if what I'm saying seems confusing, wind it back, listen to it again, see if you can unpick the meanings that I'm exploring. Okay, let's start off with this idea of what might the weather conditions symbolize. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have written about the fact that this is on a battlefield, so it's a scene of conflict. There is also thunder and lightning, so we have weather conditions here to create a stormy or tempestuous atmosphere and to establish an eerie mood. So it's dark, it's disturbing. Now, like the storm, the witches are here to cause disruption. Now, that's really important. We've got that connection between the witches and the weather. And they're very much in a troublemaking mood. So just like in a storm, we would be disrupted, we would run for cover, we'd be huddled away inside. Here, the witches are trying to cause trouble. They're trying to disrupt our normal way of life, or the way of life that we want to lead. Now, we know this technique, where conditions mirror the emotional state of characters, as pathetic fallacy. Okay, so we've got conditions, the weather, mirroring, resembling the emotional state of the characters, and we know that that's pathetic fallacy. Okay, if we then consider the first line, when shall we three meet again? This is interesting because it seems like we, the audience, are arriving at the point that their meeting is nearly over. Now, this creates a sense of mystery, or if you want to be fancy, we can call that narrative enigma, where basically we are left asking questions. We're wondering straight away, okay, what have they discussed and plotted before we got here? How many times have they met previously? How long has this meeting been going on for? Now, we're told what's going to happen next, specifically what is going to happen next. They're going to meet Macbeth on the heath. But what we're not told is why they want to meet him, or, crucially, what they intend to do with him once they've met. So we've straight away in this scene, we've almost intruded on a private, secret conversation between these three supernatural figures. And we're learning that they've got plans, they've got a plot hatched, but we're not sure what it is. So we're engaged, we're intrigued by that, and we want to find out. We want to find out what they're intending to do with Macbeth, why they want to meet him in particular. Okay, now this next question, why might the witches come as a three and why not give them individual names, I think is a particularly interesting one. And if you don't mind, I'll talk at length about this because I think there are some fascinating interpretations. If we start with their lack of individual names and consider that two other prominent women in the play, Lady Macbeth and Lady Macduff, are also not given individual names but are known simply as Lady, and then given the surname of their husband, then we might interpret Shakespeare's choice as one that is intended to highlight the powerlessness of women. Okay, so we've got that sense of no name equals no identity. So it could be a sense that they are being stripped of their power. Okay, alternatively, and I think this is where things get really interesting, and this is where Shakespeare, as an agitator, as someone who's looking to be a little bit cheeky, a little bit revolutionary in a way, is potentially making a different point. And that is that we may see the witches as a collective force or one supernatural body. So rather than seeing them as three individuals, we see them as one. Okay. When we later add Lady Macbeth into the mix, because she has an affiliation, a link to the witches, that force potentially grows. And we can argue then that Shakespeare is presenting women as powerful and hugely influential. So in the cases of both Duncan, Macbeth, and ultimately Malcolm, these witches and Lady Macbeth, so this one supernatural force, act as both king makers and king breakers. Now, what I mean by that is that they, through force of will, force of action, through their ability to manipulate, through their ability to control, they both cause the downfall of kings. They break the kings. They are king breakers, such as with the death of Duncan. And they also make kings. So they have the ability to convince Macbeth that he can become king, and they therefore play that pivotal controlling role. Now, in contrast, some of the key male characters suffer most because they are, or they become, isolated. Okay, so we've got these women together as one collective force, and we've got the men isolated, individual. Duncan is vulnerable as a king. Banquo, when he separates from Macbeth, he becomes isolated, he becomes vulnerable. And Macbeth's status is most at risk in the play once he rejects Lady Macbeth, and she then leaves the stage and eventually dies. So these men, by pursuing their own individual interests, by having or by acquiring status, they actually make themselves vulnerable. Whereas the witches, and maybe combine Lady Macbeth with that, as a collective force, they acquire a degree of strength. Okay, on the subject of threes, there are loads of theories linked to this, and you can go away and read about those in your own time. But I think there are three that are of most interest. Number one is that the number three could represent the past, the present, and the future. So this would emphasize the witches as a powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing force. They are the past, so they know what's happened. They are the present, they're in control of that present situation, but they also crucially are aware of and in control of the future. Okay, we also have the idea that the number three is a motif, M-O-T-I-F, which is a little bit like a symbol. Number three is a motif that runs throughout the play. So there are three witches. There are three titles that Macbeth holds: Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, ultimately King of Scotland. There are three predictions about Macbeth's future made early in the play, but also in Act 4, Scene 1. There are also three particular murders that Macbeth carries out or orders, those of Duncan, Banquo, and Lady Macduff. Now, those murders are all crucial because they lead to his insanity and his eventual death. Now, finally, on that idea of threes, I think the most interesting theory relates to the Christian concept of the Holy Trinity. So the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. What we have instead with the witches, especially in the eyes of James I and Jacobean theatre goers, is an unholy trinity, the opposite of that Christian concept. We have these three witches, a devilish trio who are there to cause chaos instead of bringing comfort. So those are just a few theories that you might explore when thinking about why there are three witches, why they're not given names, and why the supernatural is such an important aspect of this play. Okay, we then get on to looking about rhyme. Now, what you may have noticed is that there is rhyme in this scene. And that at times, as you'll have heard in the videos earlier, it can sound like a spell or an incantation. Now, again, that rhythmic element or rhyming element of their speech emphasizes the fact that they are witches. They have the ability to make spells. But what we also may notice in some of the language here is that we don't have full rhymes, we have half rhymes. Now, we have some full rhymes like fair and air, but we also have half rhymes like one and sun. Now, they don't quite match, and you might think, yeah, so what? This is irrelevant, so it doesn't matter. But the idea that they don't match actually gives us potentially an indication that things aren't quite right. Things that should be harmonious. Okay, the start of a play, we usually associate that, or the start of a film, we usually associate that with everything being okay, everything being normal, and the disruption coming later on. Well, Shakespeare here is starting with the disruption. He's starting with the unexpected, unconventional idea of the supernatural on stage rather than some nobleman. So we get that sense through the rhyme that something's out of place. The natural order or the natural language of Shakespearean verse has been disrupted. So there is some rhythm, some fluency in the rhyme, but there are also those moments where we kind of stutter and stop and wonder what it is that's causing that level of disruption. Okay, the hurly-burly thing is fairly self-explanatory. Clearly, they're keen on causing some chaos in the play. Now, the tone of their language, if we look at the examples here, that will be, and to meet with Macbeth, they are speaking in declaratives there. They're talking in statements. Declarative just means statements. And the tone here is very certain. And this links to the belief that witches could predict the future, that they were omniscient, all-knowing. Okay? So this was particularly disturbing to people at the time, as the majority were deeply religious and believed that God, and maybe by extension the monarch, because of the whole divine right of kings, great chain of being, was the all-knowing power in their lives. So to have three witches turn up, who are minions of the devil, and say with certainty that they know in the future they are going to meet with Macbeth, that they have that level of control of the future, that's frightening. That ability frightens the audience and makes us feel particularly disturbed. You also notice here, with these exclamation marks, this exclamatory language, that they seem quite excited. They seem quite inspired and delighted, happy about the fact that they are going to be causing trouble. They can't wait to get started. They can't wait to put the proverbial cat amongst the pigeons. Okay, we mentioned the familiars. That doesn't matter. Again, if you're thinking, I'm never going to remember all of this information about these three witches, do I need to know which witch is which? No, you don't. Think about them as a collective force, as the witches, as representatives of the supernatural. So don't worry about owls and cats. Leave that to Harry Potter. Okay, down at the bottom, we've got this language: the fair is foul and foul is fair. And what we have here is paradoxical language. Now, a paradox, and remember, this is sort of grade 8, grade 9 kind of territory here. This is something, in this case, language that seems to contradict itself. So the idea that fair, which means good, is foul, bad, that seems odd and uncomfortable. How can fair be foul and foul be fair? How can good be bad? However, on closer inspection, paradoxes can often reveal themselves to be true. And you'll see that as the play continues, as the play develops. But if we think about other things you've studied this year, if you think about Jekyll and Hyde, for example, it is true to say that Dr. Henry Jekyll is both good in terms of being a fair gentleman in the eyes of society, and bad in that he is also the foul Mr. Hyde. So Dr. Henry Jekyll is both good, fair, and bad, foul. So we have this idea of paradox, the idea of something that seems confusing, it seems muddled, but in fact, it can turn out to be true. It can actually make sense. And we see that as the play develops in the behaviour of Macbeth. As I've said, crucially, what Shakespeare is doing here is establishing a sense of confusion that sets us up for the rest of the play. And he's doing that through this paradoxical language. Right, in terms of these key images in the scene and what kind of mood or atmosphere they create, well, there's the thunder, lightning and rain. So the storm at the start that we've mentioned. I think the set of sun is interesting because it has those suggestions of death. And then, so up here, set of sun, that will be ear, the set of sun. We've got that idea of the day ending, potentially life ending. So connotations of death. We might also look at this, the fog and filthy air. Now, fog and filthy air could be interesting because it has connotations of disease and sickness. So we've got the image here of a world, or maybe, interestingly, a mind, someone's mind that has been polluted. So a question that we could ask here is, okay, so if there is pollution, who or what is doing the polluting of the Scottish air? We might think, actually, if we see the air as being a metaphor for the mind, and we ask who or what is doing the polluting of the mind, and we think about the mind being Macbeth's mind, we can see that the witches are together intending to be the ones that pollute and corrupt his mind. Okay, if we were to link that to context, we might read the fog and filthy air as being the plague that engulfed England in the early 1600s. So this again highlights the theme of sickness and disease that recurs throughout the play. That idea that there's something uneasy, there's something disturbing, as we all know at the moment, something disrupting our lives in the form of plague, a contagion. And then if we really want to zoom in on particular word choices, we might have a look at hover through down here in that final line. Because if we look at the verb hover, to hover, and the adverb through, we might suggest that these witches are able to cut through the fog that affects humans. So whilst everyone else is blinded or made sick by it, the witches can still see clearly and can therefore hover through it. They can move through it freely and actually be in a godlike position of power. Okay, so this fog and filthy air kind of paralyzes everyone else, makes them blind, whereas the witches can just serenely hover through it, maintaining a view of everything, being all-seeing, all-knowing, and controlling the situation from on high. Like I said, almost godlike. And this would frighten a Shakespearean audience and actually offend them deeply to have this idea pitched to them that it was the devil that was in control and not God, or the devil's representatives in control and not God's representative on earth, i.e. the king. So why might Shakespeare finish the scene with the witches speaking in unison, speaking together? Well, again, it goes back to that idea that we've mentioned on a number of occasions today of them being one body, one collective force, a supernatural entity, rather than three individual, kind of slightly craggy, weak, old women. Up at the top, that question's just appeared. Which themes are established in this first scene? Well, we've mentioned numerous themes. We've talked about chaos and confusion. But what I want us to do here is just think that as the play continues, it would be really good for you to think of the ideas of chaos and confusion under a broad heading of appearance versus reality. Okay, so that was a theme that you would have seen in Jekyll and Hyde, appearance and reality. So appearance being the way things look. So for example, the witches look weak and powerless, but the reality is the way that things are. So the way things are here is that the witches are in control from start, Act 1, Scene 1, first moments on stage, all the way through the play. Okay, we've also had the theme of supernatural and the themes of power and sickness. And sickness is one you can think of as sickness and disease. So just to recap those key themes, we've got appearance versus reality. We've got the supernatural, we've got power, and we've got sickness and disease. Okay, and then the final thing to consider, how might the audience feel upon the departure of these women from the stage? Well, come on to the next slide and we will try and work out an answer to that question. On this slide, you will see that there is an emotion wheel that I know many of you were given at some point this year by your teachers, potentially when you were studying Blood Brothers or in Inspector Calls. These are really useful tools, actually, because often when we talk about characters' emotions, the feelings that they are experiencing, we can use quite bland and actually quite inexact language. So you can see happy, well, there's a broad array of things that constitute happiness. Angry, well, there isn't just one type of anger, is there, or one kind of expression of anger? There are lots of different types of anger that become more or less severe. So we can use an emotion wheel. You might access that if you've got your books at home. And we might wonder, how might the audience use that? We might use the emotion wheel to wonder, how might the audience respond to the opening scene? And I've just put some words up here that could be useful for you. So if you want to take a minute, pause the video, jot down any words that you think are appropriate in describing the audience's reaction. And if you're, again, targeting grade 7+, what you might want to do at this stage is consider the way a Jacobean audience, so an audience at the time of James I, might have responded to this scene, and briefly compare it to how a modern audience is likely to react to this scene. If there's a difference that you spot, what do you think the likely cause of that difference would be? Okay, so pause the video, jot down some ideas about how the audience might respond to Act 1, Scene 1. Okay, this next slide is one that, unless you are really pushing yourself for the top grades in English literature, you can fast forward through and move on to the next stage of the lesson, which will be to write a more developed response to the question that we posed at the start in terms of how what happens in Act 1, Scene 1 and how is mood and atmosphere created. If you are reaching for the stars, so to speak, and you're after a grade 8 or 9, what we might spend a few minutes doing is just looking at structure. Now, we've looked quite a lot at language. We mentioned rhythm and rhyme that are structural features, but here we're going to look at form and structure and the meaning, effect that they can convey. So, a bit of background on this is that Shakespeare usually wrote the lines of his high status or upper class characters in iambic pentameter. So iambic pentameter is something that I'm sure you will have come across previously. These are lines of verse that consist of 5 unstressed and 5 stressed syllables or beats. Okay, so an iamb, as in iambic, is a metric foot. Now each foot within poetry or verse contains 2 syllables or beats. So in an iamb, the first syllable is unstressed, the second is stressed. So for example, in the word football. Okay, foot is unstressed, ball is stressed. Interestingly, if we put on an American accent at this point, the stress is often kind of reversed. So you end up with football, although they'd say soccer, wouldn't they? So that kind of doesn't make sense. Anyway, there are 5 of these feet per line, hence pentameter. So you've got 5 feet of unstressed and stressed iambs or syllables. Now, characters of lower status or class typically spoke in prose. Now, this is regular speech with no particular pattern of rhyme or rhythm. Prose is linked to the word prosaic, which means plain, dull. So he gave his low status characters, often the servants, the people that were the underlings of the nobles and the kings, these lines of this method of speaking. Now, there are various theatrical reasons for this, one of which being that high status characters would have had the majority of the lines in the plays. In Shakespeare's time, audiences actually expected a different play to be performed every day, and those plays would have been performed by the same troupe, the same acting troupe, the same actors. That meant they had a huge amount to remember, a huge amount to kind of memorize, and then perform on a daily basis, alternating play to play. So iambic pentameter was actually a device that Shakespeare used to enable them to remember their lines more easily. And the actors that would have played the minor roles, the roles of the working class, lower status characters, they could probably be relied on to remember a few simple lines of prose, whereas those higher status main actors, those central stars of the show, they will have been learning hundreds of lines, so the iambic pentameter helped them to do that. Anyway, that's enough theatre geekery. We've got that contrast, crucially, between verse and prose. Now, if you look back at Act 1, Scene 1, what do you notice about the way that Shakespeare has written the witch's lines? And does it fit either of these styles? And what you'll notice that it's sort of somewhere in between. Okay, there certainly isn't that regular iambic pentameter, so you haven't got that regular rhythm. And we've got some rhyme, but it's not regular rhyme, it's not consistent rhyme. What we have got, when we do have moments of rhythm and rhyme that are repeated, is we have something called trochaic tetrameter. Now, the trochee is the opposite of an iamb. So if iamb is unstressed, stressed, a trochee is stressed, unstressed. So if we look at the line here, fair is foul and foul is fair, we can see the stresses in these trochees. So this is one trochee, fair is, foul and, that's your second one, foul is your third foot, your third metric foot, and fair is an incomplete metric foot. So you've got 7 syllables or 7 beats, but the emphasis, the stress, is put on these crucial words. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. So you can hear in my reading of that the emphasis is placed on those words, and it encourages a kind of angry tone to be used, a tone that sounds forceful, it sounds malevolent. Fair is foul, foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. So it has that rhythm to it, it has that aggression to it, it has that intent to it. And that's what the witches are all about. They're all about imposing themselves and showing intent at this early stage of the play. You may recognise this technique actually from William Blake's London. So in, I think it's the last line of the first stanza from memory, you've got marks of weakness, marks of woe. And that line marks the transition in that poem from iambic rhythm to trochaic rhythm. So he starts off wandering through these chartered streets, and it sounds quite relaxed, it sounds quite calm. But by the end of that stanza, when he's realizing that everything he's seeing is horrific, every person he's seeing is suffering, the meter very carefully, very interestingly shifts. It goes from iambic to trochaic. So he then starts with this marks of weakness, marks of woe. And again, we can see the emphasis on those much more disturbing, kind of aggressive sounding words that indicate his feelings towards the scene that he's witnessing as he walks through London. Anyway, back to Macbeth. Have a look at those lines, see if you can apply that this new advanced terminology to your reading of Act 1, Scene 1. And when we come to write the paragraph later, stretch yourself and see if you can write about the trochaic tetrameter and what effect that seems to have on the performance and on the mood and atmosphere. Okay, folks, we are now ready to answer this question. How does Shakespeare begin the play, and what kind of mood or atmosphere is created? So you're going to pause the video and write down the question, and then you're going to write an extended response. Now, having put all that work in, having done all that preparatory note-taking, I think it would be reasonable to expect at least 200 words. Okay, so to make the most of all that we've done today, it would be a good idea if you aim to write about a side in response to this question. Now, if you're aiming for a grade 4 or grade 4 and above, you must include at least 3 quotes. That's crucial. And you should aim for one from near the start, one from the middle, one from near the end. Now, later in this unit, you will have lessons on how to respond to an extract, but this is just a kind of early example of how you might do that. Now, for a grade 5+, you should be doing the above, so including at least 3 quotations or details, and then explaining the meaning and effect of these details. At this point, you're using analytical language. We're saying this implies, this suggests, this might connote, this could symbolize, this may represent. So here we're becoming more analytical. And then if you want to produce work that is of grade 7+ standard, you need to be doing all of the above and using more evaluative language. So this might imply, although another reader may interpret this to mean. So here we're offering an alternative interpretation. And we're doing this when we're considering the scene and the audience's potential reaction to it. But we'll also be looking to use a wider range of more precise subject terminology. So that kind of advanced stuff we've mentioned, paradoxical, imagery, trochaic tetrameter. Right, so pause the video, give yourself as long as you need to write a full detailed response. Again, if you're aiming for the top end, if you're writing 200 words, you should be aiming really to include at least 6 quotes or details in support of your ideas. Off you go. Just to butt in briefly, if you are needing further help, you can just press play and have a look at the next slide that will guide you through how to do it. It'll give you much more structure. So let's just skip on to the next slide if you're feeling a bit stuck. Okay, so if you're onto this slide with me, basically start your answer by summing up the scene. So simply write a couple of sentences saying who's involved, where is it set, what happens, and you've got a sentence starter here to get you going. Okay, your second step, and remember you can pause these step by step and work it at your own pace. You then write about what kind of mood or atmosphere is created at the start of the scene, including a quote or detail to support your views. So again, we've got a sentence starter there, space for a quote, space for a quote to be put in here, and here is a space for a word to be put in, an adjective to describe the atmosphere. So as the scene begins, there is a eerie atmosphere or a stormy atmosphere. Okay, step 3, you need to then write about how the mood and atmosphere develops as the scene continues, including a quote or detail. So again, we've got an example sentence. As the scene develops, the atmosphere remains murky, gloomy, as shown by the words, and we're going to put some more evidence in here. You could then extend on that by just making a brief comment about what those words suggest, what those words show the reader. Step 4, okay, we're just doing the same thing, guys, but here we're focusing on the end of the scene. So you're focused on the middle, the beginning, and now you're looking at the end. So you want to include a quote or a detail from towards the end of the scene. I'd be using something like fair is foul, foul is fair. We're saying how the atmosphere might be becoming increasingly confused or increasingly dark and gloomy. And then we're using a quote to back that up and potentially just making a comment there about the language choices that Shakespeare has included. And then the final step in your answer is just to write a sentence about what the audience might think or feel at the end of the scene. So here we're kind of summing up the effect that this scene will have had on the people watching it. So as the scene ends and the witches disappear, the audience might feel. So we're going to explain how they are left feeling as the scene finishes. Okay, have a go. Do your best to jot down your thoughts on this first scene. Right, folks, there's been a lot for you to digest today, a lot for you to take on board. So I think it's important that we spend just a few minutes at the end reviewing what we have learned. Now, a formula that I quite like to use when writing summaries of scenes, and this is a really lovely revision technique actually, is just to take something from science, take something from chemistry, and just use almost like a chemical formula. So Act 1, Scene 1 equals this plus this plus this plus this plus this. You're going to just try and include 5 items in your equation. Now, if you want to be creative, You could change the symbols, so you could say minus the main characters, because obviously we don't have Macbeth and Lady Macbeth in the first scene. Macbeth is mentioned, but he doesn't appear on stage. Okay, so pause the video, write your scene summary in the following format. Okay, once you've done that, we'll just finish off by going back to this terminology grid. So as I said earlier, hopefully a word like mood or atmosphere is now one that you have pretty much all got a clear understanding of. You'll be able to give an example of mood and atmosphere in Act 1, Scene 1. You can explain what mood and atmosphere are. Okay, you might be looking to get some of these other words in, like foreshadowing, pathetic fallacy, paradox. Try and move them, if you can, if you now feel that you understand them, to another column. So pause the video, update your terminology grid. And that's it. Act 1, Scene 1, done. Hopefully today's lesson has equipped you with a really good understanding of the scene. You've enjoyed digging into the language and kind of exploring some of the interpretations and some of the intentions in Shakespeare's choices. If you're intrigued by this theme of the supernatural, theme of witchcraft, I would suggest that you go away and read Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which is set in Salem in America, so Salem, Massachusetts, during a period, based on a true story of witch trials that took place in Salem, Massachusetts. So have a look for The Crucible, have a read. It's a brilliant play. If you love drama, I'm sure you would enjoy it. But if you love politics, if you love the theories of the supernatural, and basically are interested in looking at the way people can use power and use language to manipulate and to control and convict and all of those things, then you might find The Crucible a really interesting read. Right, that's it for today. Thanks for working hard. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you tomorrow.